There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere with your friends that makes you feel invincible. It's like the world shrinks down to just the few of you, a small, self-contained bubble of laughter and camaraderie. That's how we felt when we decided to go camping that weekend. Just 4 friends, a couple of tents, and the open wilderness. We had no idea that something, or rather, someone, would shatter that bubble and leave us questioning everything we thought we knew about safety in the wild. The idea was simple. Drive out to a remote campground, set up camp, and spend a few days hiking, fishing, and forgetting about the stresses of everyday life. No phones, no internet, just us and nature. On the day of the trip, the sky was a perfect blue, and the road wound through forests and past glistening lakes. We played music, sang along, and laughed at stupid jokes. It was just the kind of carefree road trip you'd expect when you're with your closest friends. We reached the campsite in the late afternoon. It was more remote than we'd anticipated, tucked away in a valley. There were no other campers in sight, just an empty ranger station at the entrance and a few worn-out signs marking the trails. The isolation didn't bother us. In fact, we welcomed it. It was exactly what we were looking for, a place to disconnect. We set up our tents in a clearing near the edge of the forest, close to a small stream that provided a constant, soothing background noise. The sun was beginning to set, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was perfect. After setting up camp, we gathered around a fire pit that Ethan, our resident camping enthusiast, had quickly put together. We roasted hot dogs, shared stories, and let the peace of the wilderness wash over us. As the night fell and the stars came out, we felt like we were the only people in the world. It was exactly the kind of escape we had all needed. But that sense of peace didn't last long. It was around 9 p.m. when we first saw him. We were deep into a conversation about some dumb thing that had happened back on campus when Ethan suddenly stopped talking, his eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight. His face, which had been animated with laughter just moments before, now held a look of confusion. "What is it?" I asked, turning to follow his gaze. Standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a heavy jacket and jeans, even though the weather was mild. His hair was long and unkempt, and his face was partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see the glint of his eyes reflecting the firelight. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching us. For a moment, none of us spoke. The sight of him was so unexpected, so out of place, that it took a second for my brain to catch up with what I was seeing. We were miles away from the nearest town, and the campground was deserted. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice cautious. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was something off about him, something that set off alarm bells in my mind, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Can we help you?" Avery, always the polite one, asked, though I could hear the nervousness in her voice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man stepped forward into the light. His face came into view, and I felt a jolt of unease. He looked older than I had first thought, his skin pale and drawn, with deep lines etched into his features. His eyes were hollow, almost lifeless, and his lips were curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "No need to worry," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Just passing through." Passing through? It didn't make any sense. There was nothing to pass through to. This place was remote, isolated, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here unless they had a specific destination in mind. "Are you camping nearby?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the tension in his posture. The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just enjoying the night," he replied, his gaze shifting from Ethan to the rest of us. "It's peaceful out here, isn't it?" None of us knew what to say. There was something about him that made my stomach twist with unease, but I didn't want to be rude. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a stranger, probably out for a walk like he said. But the way he was looking at us, like he was sizing us up, made me feel like we were prey. "Well, we're just having a quiet night ourselves," Ethan said, clearly trying to steer the conversation to a close. "We'll let you get back to your walk." The man nodded, that same unsettling smile still on his face. "Of course. You folks have a good night." With that, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. We watched him go, the firelight flickering on our faces, none of us speaking until we were sure he was gone. "That was weird," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "Weird? That was straight up creepy," Avery replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe he's just a local," Ethan offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Some people like to camp alone." "Maybe," I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We piled into the car, the fear thick in the air, and sped out of the campsite, leaving the man and the forest behind. We didn't stop driving until we were well out of the mountains, the lights of the nearest town coming into view. I had been eagerly anticipating this camping trip, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and spend quality time with my family. It was meant to be a simple getaway, just me, my wife, and our 2 children, surrounded by nature, away from the pressures of daily life. We found a campground that promised tranquility, nestled in a national park with a serene river nearby. It seemed like the perfect location. The drive out was exactly how we had imagined it, with the kids chattering excitedly in the back seat as we wound our way through the mountains. The towering trees above us cast dappled shadows on the road, and the cool, crisp air was a welcome relief from the sweltering heat of the city. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to sink toward the horizon. The campground exceeded our expectations. Spacious, with plenty of room for the kids to explore, and only a few other campers scattered in the distance, far enough to make us feel like we had the place to ourselves. We chose a spot near the edge of the woods, close enough to the river that we could hear the soothing rush of water in the distance. My wife and I set up the tent while the kids ran around, their laughter echoing through the trees. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, the fresh smell of pine filled the air. It was idyllic, the kind of evening that made you feel everything in life was right. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The kids were all smiles, their faces glowing in the firelight, and I remember feeling a deep sense of contentment. This was what life was all about, these simple moments spent with the ones you love. But as the fire died down and the stars began to twinkle through the tree canopy, an unsettling feeling crept over me. It was faint at first, just a slight sense of unease that I tried to brush off. After all, it was probably just the usual nerves that come with being in the middle of nowhere. But that feeling didn't go away. The kids, exhausted from a day of exploring, were soon tucked into their sleeping bags inside the tent, and we zipped it up tight. My wife and I stayed by the fire a bit longer, enjoying the silence, the crackle of embers, and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The world felt peaceful, almost dreamlike. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, barely distinguishable from the natural noises of the forest, but it grew louder as I strained to listen. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching on the gravel path that wound through the campground. I glanced at my wife, but she seemed lost in thought, staring into the fire. I didn't want to alarm her, so I stayed quiet, telling myself it was just another camper returning to their tent. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew closer, heavier, like whoever it was moving with purpose. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. But I couldn't see anything, just the trees, the shadows, and the faint outline of the tent where our kids were sleeping. Then, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I felt exposed, vulnerable, sitting there in the dark with only the fading fire between us and whatever or whoever was out there. I opened my mouth to say something, to suggest we go inside the tent, but before I could, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of fabric rustling, like someone brushing against the side of the tent. My blood ran cold. The tent was only a few feet away, its faint outline visible in the dim light, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was outside, moving around it, maybe even touching it. My wife must have sensed my tension because she looked up at me, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" she whispered. I shook my head, not wanting to scare her, but her expression told me she already knew something wasn't right. "I think there's someone out there," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. She didn't say anything, just nodded, her hand reaching for mine. We sat in silence, straining our ears for any sound, but the forest had gone completely still. The only noise was the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. For what felt like an eternity we stayed there, hearts pounding. But when nothing happened, when the footsteps didn't return, I began to relax, convincing myself it was just my imagination. "It's probably just an animal," my wife suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "Yeah," I agreed, though I didn't believe it. "Probably just a raccoon or something." But the unease still gnawed at me, lingering in the back of my mind. We decided to call it a night. We doused the fire and retreated to the safety of the tent. The kids were sound asleep, their breathing steady and soft, unaware of the tension in the air. We crawled into our sleeping bags, zipping them up tight, the thin fabric our only shield from the darkness outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to every rustle of the leaves, every creak of a branch. Every sound sent a jolt of fear through me, and my mind conjured up images of shadows lurking just beyond the tent, waiting to strike. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Then, I woke up to the sound of the zipper on the tent being pulled open. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The tent was dark, the only light from the moon filtering through the trees, but the sound of that zipper, slow, deliberate, sent a wave of terror through me. I sat up, my heart racing. My wife was already awake, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with fear. The kids were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger. The zipper stopped halfway, leaving the tent partially open, and I could feel the cool night air creeping in, but there was no movement, no sound from outside. I reached for the flashlight, my hands trembling, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent, but I couldn't bring myself to shine it on the opening. What if something, or someone, was standing there? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Stay here," I whispered to my wife. My voice was shaking. She nodded, gripping my hand tightly, her eyes pleading with me not to go. But I couldn't just wait and do nothing. I slowly turned the flashlight toward the opening, my heart hammering in my chest. The light cut through the darkness, revealing the partially open flap of the tent, but there was nothing there. Just the empty void beyond. I exhaled, my shoulders sagging with relief. Maybe it was just a curious animal, something small that had wandered too close. I was about to close the tent when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakably human. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. The voice was low, raspy, and filled with a menacing undertone that sent a chill down my spine. I turned the flashlight back toward the opening, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly hold the light steady. But there was still nothing. Just the impenetrable darkness beyond. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. My eyes were locked on the void outside. And then, without warning, the tent shook violently as if something had slammed into it from the outside. The kids woke up with a start, their cries filling the tent as they scrambled out of their sleeping bags, wide-eyed with fear. My wife tried to comfort them, her voice trembling as she reassured them everything was okay, but we both knew it wasn't. The tent shook again, the fabric straining against some unseen force. I could hear the sound of heavy breathing, low and guttural, just outside. Stay here, I whispered again, grabbing the camping knife from my pack. I'm going to see what it is. No! My wife's voice was filled with terror. Don't go out there. But I had to protect my family. I had to find out what was out there. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever waited outside. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The flashlight beam illuminated the campground, but the forest was eerily silent. I scanned the area, the light bouncing off the trees, the shadows twisting in the beam, but there was nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone or anything. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again. The whisper. Coming from the trees. Let me in. My heart raced as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just the dense underbrush, the tall pines, and the pitch-black void beyond. But I felt it, the presence. Something was there, lurking just out of sight, watching me. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling, and ducked back into the tent, quickly zipping it up. My wife and kids huddled together, their faces pale with fear. We're leaving, I whispered, my voice firm now. We didn't waste any time. We packed up our gear quickly, frantic, desperate. The kids were too scared to cry, their eyes wide with fear as we moved. I could feel the presence lingering outside, watching us, but it didn't make another sound, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. We finished packing, grabbed the car keys with trembling hands, and piled into the car. My wife held the kids close, her eyes scanning the darkness outside the windows. I started the engine, and we sped out of the campground, the tires kicking up gravel. The road twisted through the trees, the forest closing in around us, but I didn't dare slow down. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with everything that had just happened, the voice, the shaking tent, the overwhelming sense of being watched. It all felt like a nightmare, something too terrifying to be real, but it was real. It had happened, and we had barely escaped. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were miles away from that place. Finally, we pulled into a rest stop. The kids were asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the night's terror. My wife and I sat in the car, the silence between us heavy with the unspoken horror of what we'd just experienced. What was it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't know. I still don't. But I do know one thing. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Something that wanted to get inside. And we were lucky to get away. I don't know what would have happened if I had let it in, and I hope I never find out. Finding the ideal camping spot brings with it a special sense of excitement, a place that feels pristine, untouched, where you can completely disconnect and immerse yourself in the natural world. That's exactly what we were after when we set out on that trip. We sought to escape the noise, the crowds, and the constant hum of technology. We wanted solitude, peace, and the chance to reconnect with ourselves and each other. We found what we thought was that spot. It was late summer, the kind of warm, golden days that make you feel like you're living in a postcard. We decided to take a weekend trip to a remote lake we had heard about through word of mouth. It was supposed to be beautiful, surrounded by dense forests, far from the nearest town. The kind of place that feels like it's just for you, hidden away from the world. The drive was long, taking us deeper into the mountains than we had ever gone before. The road turned from pavement to gravel and then to dirt, winding through thick stands of pine and birch. The air grew cooler, fresher, and the scent of the forest filled the car. We parked at the edge of a small clearing where the trees opened just enough to give us a view of the lake. It was perfect, calm and still, the surface of the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There wasn't another soul in sight, just the four of us and the wilderness. We set up our tents near the water's edge, unpacked our gear, and settled in for what we believed would be a peaceful weekend. The lake was serene. It felt like we had stepped into another world, far removed from the chaos of everyday life. That first evening was everything we had hoped for. We cooked dinner over a campfire, shared stories, and watched the sunset over the lake. The sky changed from orange to pink to deep purple. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a blanket of twinkling lights. It was the kind of night that made you feel small in the best possible way, like you were a part of something much bigger. We stayed up late talking and laughing, the fire crackling between us. There was a sense of contentment, of rightness, that made us all feel like we had found something special. We were disconnected from the world but connected to each other, to nature, to something deeper. But as the fire burned low and the night grew colder, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It was a vague unease, something I couldn't quite place, making me glance over my shoulder more than once, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. I told myself it was nothing. After all, we were miles from anywhere, and there was nothing out there but trees and animals. What could possibly go wrong? The next morning dawned clear and bright, the lake glistening in the early light. We woke up feeling refreshed, the unease from the night before forgotten in the daylight. We spent the day exploring, hiking along the shoreline, and swimming in the cool, clear water. It was everything we had hoped for, a perfect escape. But as the day went on, little things started to feel off. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming the day before, now felt somehow darker. The trees pressed in closer, their shadows stretching longer. The birds, which had filled the air with their songs, had fallen silent, leaving an eerie stillness over the lake. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the unease crept back in, stronger this time. It gnawed at the edges of my mind. Later that evening, as we sat around the campfire again, the sky turning a deep blue as the sun set, Mark went back to the tent to grab a jacket. The rest of us were talking, the firelight flickering on our faces, but when Mark returned, he seemed different. There was a tension in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that wasn't there before. He didn't say anything, just sat down and stared into the fire, his expression distant. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mark hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just thought I saw something in the woods. Probably nothing." The way he said it made my skin prickle. "What did you see?" He shook his head, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know. Probably just a deer or something." But I could tell he didn't believe that, and neither did I. We tried to move past it and enjoy the evening like before, but the mood had shifted. The conversation became forced. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Finally, Emily suggested we turn in early. No one argued. We doused the fire and headed for the tent. But as I crawled into my sleeping bag, the unease gnawed at me, making it impossible to relax. The forest, which had been so silent earlier, was now alive with noise, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. But beneath it all, there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the air, making my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest amplified by my imagination. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that didn't belong. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on the outside of the tent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, coming from the side of the tent closest to the woods. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She stirred, groggy and confused. "Hear what?" The tapping stopped for a moment. There was only silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. Then, just as I was about to brush it off as a dream, it started again, louder and more insistent. Sarah sat up, eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling, "but it's coming from outside." We sat frozen, listening to the sound. It was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get our attention. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking, and flicked it on, illuminating the inside of the tent. Should we look? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to ignore it. But curiosity, the need to know what was out there, was too strong. Stay here, I whispered, my voice firmer than I felt. I'll check it out. Before she could protest, I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out. The night was dark, but the moonlight provided just enough light to see. I turned the flashlight toward the source of the sound, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty woods, silent and still. I stepped out of the tent, the cold air biting at my skin, and shone the light around the campsite. Everything was as we'd left it. The fire pit, the chairs, the other tent where Mark and Emily were sleeping. But as I moved closer to their tent, I noticed something strange. The flap of their tent was open, the zipper undone, flapping slightly in the breeze. Mark? Emily? I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I moved closer, shining the flashlight into their tent. My stomach twisted with dread, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were there, the blankets still rumpled, as if they had just gotten up, but there was no sign of them. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Sarah, get out here! I called louder this time. She scrambled out of the tent, her face pale with fear. What is it? They're gone, I said, my voice hollow. Mark and Emily, they're gone. We searched the campsite, calling their names, our voices echoing through the trees. But there was no sign of them, nothing to indicate where they'd gone. Panic set in quickly. The realization that Mark and Emily were gone, that we were alone in the middle of nowhere with no idea what had happened to them, was like a punch to the gut. We grabbed our things, not bothering to pack properly, just shoving everything into our bags as fast as we could. We need to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice trembling with fear. We need to find help. I didn't argue. The fear in her eyes mirrored my own. We didn't know what had taken Mark and Emily, but we knew we had to get out of that place. We left the campsite in a rush, the darkness pressing in around us as we made our way to the car. The forest, which had been so peaceful just a day before, now felt menacing. Every shadow seemed to hide some unknown threat. When we reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. We threw our bags into the back seat and climbed in. The cold air was a welcome relief from the suffocating fear that had gripped us. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The car didn't start. I tried again, but the engine refused to turn over. Panic surged through me. My mind raced. Had someone tampered with the car? Had something else? The feeling of being trapped deepened. We were alone, cut off from the rest of the world, with no way to escape. I looked at Sarah, her face as pale as mine. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the weight of what had happened slowly sinking in. I'll never forget that night, the sense of helplessness and dread that filled the air. To this day, I don't know what happened to Mark and Emily. I don't know what took them, or why. But I know one thing for sure, we stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been. Something ancient, something that didn't belong to the world we know. I don't ever want to go back. And I don't think I ever will. We had been planning this trip for weeks. 4 friends looking for a little adventure before summer ended, and we all headed off to our separate colleges. The plan was simple. Find a secluded camping spot, disconnect from the world, and enjoy a few nights under the stars. It was meant to be fun, a break from the routine of daily life. But as I sit here now, trying to piece together what transpired, I can't help but wonder if we made a huge mistake. It all began with a map. Ryan, our self-proclaimed outdoors enthusiast, had found it online, a detailed map of a little-known forest deep in the mountains, far from any well-worn trails. He was the one who convinced us to go. It's supposed to be haunted, he said with a grin, holding up the map like a treasure. You guys up for some ghost hunting? I wasn't really a believer in ghosts, and I'm pretty sure none of the others were either. But the idea of exploring a haunted forest had a certain intrigue. We were looking for something different, something a little exciting. We all laughed it off as a joke, teasing Ryan about his obsession with creepy stories, but in the end, we agreed it would at least make for a good story. The drive up to the forest was uneventful. The road wound through thick woods, which seemed to grow denser the farther we traveled. The sun was still high in the sky, casting dappled light through the canopy, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and earth. It felt peaceful, almost idyllic, and I remember thinking how absurd it was that this place was supposed to be haunted. We parked the car at the edge of the forest, where the road ended in a small clearing. From there, it was all on foot. We packed up our gear, double-checked the map, and started our hike into the woods. The trail was narrow, barely more than a footpath, winding its way through the trees. The deeper we ventured, the quieter it became, with the sounds of the outside world fading until all we could hear was the rustle of leaves and the crunch of our boots on the dirt. Ryan led the way, with Jess and me following close behind. Matt brought up the rear, his usual laid-back attitude keeping everyone in good spirits. We joked and laughed as we walked, the kind of banter that comes naturally among friends who've known each other for ages. But as the sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the mood started to shift. It began with the feeling of being watched. I can't pinpoint when it started, but at some point during the hike, I began to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my eyes scanning the trees for anything unusual. I didn't say anything at first, chalking it up to nerves, or maybe just the eerie atmosphere of the place. But as we pressed on, that feeling intensified, becoming more insistent. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. Just ahead, in the fading light, there was a figure standing among the trees. It was barely visible, more of a shadowy outline, but it was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks, staring at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The others stopped and turned to look, but by the time they did, the figure had vanished. "See what?" Ryan asked, glancing around. "There was someone there," I said, pointing to the spot where I had seen the figure. "Right there, in the trees." Matt laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind you give when you're not entirely sure if something's a joke. "You're just seeing things," he said. "It's getting dark and your mind's playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I'd seen. There had been someone, or something, standing there, watching us. But the others brushed it off, and we kept moving, even though the feeling of unease lingered. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was swallowed by darkness, I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. We made camp in a small clearing, a patch of open ground surrounded by towering trees. By the time we set up our tents, the last light of day had faded completely, and the forest around us was alive with the sounds of night, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ryan got a fire going, the flames crackling and casting a warm glow that pushed back the encroaching darkness. We gathered around the fire, the tension from earlier slowly fading as we settled into the familiar rhythm of camp life. Jess and Matt unpacked food, and soon we were roasting marshmallows and telling stories, just like we always did on these trips. But even as we laughed and talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest felt too quiet, the darkness too thick, pressing in on us from all sides. And every now and then, I thought I saw movement just beyond the reach of the firelight, a flicker of shadow, a brief glimpse of something in the trees. It wasn't until later, when we were deep into one of Ryan's ghost stories, something about a haunted cabin in the woods, that we heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible. But it was enough to stop us all dead in our tracks. We turned our heads in unison, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from the darkness beyond the fire, a soft, breathy voice that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. We nodded, scanning the shadows, but we couldn't see anything. "It's probably just the wind," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to continue our conversation, but the mood had shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with something we couldn't quite identify. The fire crackled, the only sound in the oppressive silence that had settled over the camp. And then we heard it again, the whisper, closer this time, like someone was standing just beyond the circle of light, watching us. "Who's there?" Ryan called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Just the soft rustling of leaves, the whisper of the wind. But I could feel it now, a presence in the darkness, something watching us. Matt stood up, grabbing a flashlight from his pack. "I'm going to check it out," he said, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Don't go too far," Jess warned, her eyes wide with fear. Matt nodded and flicked on the flashlight. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, and we watched him go, the firelight casting long shadows across his face, making him look older, more serious than I'd ever seen him. He reached the edge of the clearing and shone the light into the trees. The beam bounced off the trunks and branches, illuminating nothing but darkness. But then, the light caught something that made my blood run cold. A shadow with hollow eyes. It was there for just a second, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through me. "Matt!" I shouted, my voice shaking. He turned, the flashlight beam swinging wildly as he ran back to the fire. "Did you see that?" he gasped, his face pale, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. We all nodded, too scared to speak. The whisper came again, louder this time, almost like a hiss. It was so close now that I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Let's get inside the tents," Jess said, her voice trembling. We scrambled into our tents, zipping them up tight. The thin fabric was the only thing standing between us and whatever was out there. I lay in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with what I had seen, the shadow. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. But it had been there, watching us with those hollow eyes. And the whisper, it wasn't just the wind. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, the forest seemed different. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, but the warmth that usually accompanied a new day was gone. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the feeling of being watched lingered, even in the light of day. We didn't talk much as we broke camp, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the previous night. Ryan tried to lighten the mood, joking about how we'd let a few spooky sounds get to us, but his laughter sounded hollow, forced. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us wanted to be the first to say it. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes kept drifting to the edge of the clearing, to the spot where Matt had seen that face. The memory of it sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. But the forest was still. "We should get out of here," Jess said quietly, breaking the silence. We all nodded in agreement. The unspoken fear settled over us like a heavy blanket. The thought of spending another night in that forest was unbearable. We felt it, the need to leave, to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. We started down the trail, the path winding through the trees, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The silence was deafening, the only sounds our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, as we rounded another bend in the trail, we saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the path, blocking our way. My heart lurched in my chest as I recognized it. The same face I had seen the night before, pale and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The figure stood there motionless, watching us. Ryan was the first to react. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, fading into the air like smoke. I blinked, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, leaving nothing but the empty path ahead. "What the hell was that?" Matt muttered, his voice barely audible. We didn't stay to find out. We ran. By the time we reached the car, breathless and terrified, the sun was setting again. The forest behind us seemed to stretch on forever, dark and impenetrable. We didn't look back as we sped away, the wheels kicking up dirt and gravel as we raced down the road. It wasn't until we were miles from the forest that I felt like I could breathe again. None of us spoke about it, not at the time, but we all knew something had happened out there, something none of us could explain. We never went back to that forest, and I don't think we ever will. Now, every time I hear a whisper on the wind or feel a cold shiver run down my spine, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. If these stories gave you chills, make sure to hit the like button and share the fright with your friends. Subscribe for more bone-chilling tales and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment of terror. Have a creepy camping experience to share? Drop it in the comments, we're all ears. Remember, the wilderness hides secrets, and sometimes it's best not to venture into them alone. Stay safe and keep watching for more spine-tingling stories. See you in the next video.